Well, we have, believe it or not, come to the end of the Devex at UNGA sessions and even near the end of the UN General Assembly week. It's been a marathon and a sprint at the same time, as it always is. And you know this better than I think anyone. So we are so honored to have Mark Malloch-Brown, the president of the Open Society Foundations, close out our program here at the UN General Assembly. And maybe just, I want to talk about OSF. You're in the news a lot in ways you may like or not. I want to talk about all of that, but I do want to just start with your take on this year's UN General Assembly, Mark, because it is kind of, in a way, a window on the state of the world. And, you've had your shoulder against the wheel of these issues for a really long time. You were the Deputy Secretary General. You helped to create the Millennium Development Goals. Now you're working on the Sustainable Development Goals. What did this year's UN General Assembly in particular mean to you? What should we all take away from it?
Well, I think it was quite a problematic one, actually. When you have a chief executive of an organization open it by saying it's broken, it doesn't work, it's challenging because, I think that's sort of got very much echoed what other people felt, and this, in a way, unfortunate coincidence that all but one of the P5 heads of government were not here, only Biden was here, all contributed to a sense of, perhaps losing relevance. Having said that, they sort of managed to pull not exactly some white rabbits out of hats, but limbs of rabbits out of hats. The SDG outcome was a bit better than it looked as though it was going to be a few weeks earlier. Biden, Guterres made a little bit of a virtue of saying that you can only come to my climate event if you've lived up to your commitments. And, the British Prime Minister managed to put a very large foot in his mouth back in Britain by using that exact day to back off the targets that the Brits had. A bit of a British story. I mean, I'm not sure it had much echo here, but so and maybe the final point is to say, I mean, I've for many years felt that a little bit like those of theatre goers who go to the Edinburgh Festival, for a long time, the Edinburgh Fringe, the unofficial festival, has been a more dynamic place than the official festival. And there's an element of that nowadays about UNGA, that the energy is in the events around it, including this, rather than the main event itself. And I think that remains the case. And, that's really the case because the action on the thing that was top of mind, probably for most heads of government speakers, was MDB reform, extra finance for poverty and climate. And that doesn't happen here at UNGA. If it happens at Marrakesh. It potentially happens at the G7. It happens at other places.
Yeah, the number of conversations I had that said, well, when we get to Marrakesh, when we get to Dubai, right? But here we are in New York, what's coming out of this? You run an institution that has been focused on a core set of issues, democracy and human rights. Right now, we know the SDGs are way off track, but probably the most off track are democracy and human rights. We've had 2 decades of backsliding on these issues. I know you just put out, I think, the world's largest poll ever on this question. Some 36,000 people you interviewed in 30 countries. They basically said they believe in democracy. So that's sort of the good news headline. Underneath that, young people believe in democracy the least. And I guess I wonder, before we talk about what OSF itself is doing, what is the state? Why have we had 2 decades of a decline? What is the current state of democracy and human rights?
Well, I think there are different regions. It's a slightly different answer, but, common to much of it is it ain't delivering. And in that sense, people are not just critical of democracy. They're critical of incumbent forms of government which are not delivering. I mean, we're living in a world where very reasonably people's aspirations and expectations are growing at a vast rate. People aspire to see their kids have a decent education, to have health care for themselves and their families, to have security in their streets, to have, not have criminal gangs in their neighborhoods. And, all these sort of basic asks are frustrated at the moment, and by governments that aren't delivering. Now, the good news is democratic governments, because they have the safety valve that if they don't do very well, you can boot them out, and they have a culture of much greater sort of serious policy engagement, probably are the long distance runners versus the authoritarian governments, which are populist, don't really have enduring solutions to much, and overstay their welcome and have no decent exit strategy because they don't believe in elections. So I think the swing of the pendulum will come back, but for now, this delivery issue at a time of demographic change in the world is creating a crisis for government, and therefore also a crisis for democracy.
And you are leading the world's largest foundation working on that crisis. So maybe we can just for a minute talk about what's happening at OSF. And I'll lay out a couple of kind of the data points, and you can tell us what's happening. Yeah. Just as one of many examples of the pushback you get. Just this week here in New York, Elon Musk said you are trying to destroy Western civilization. But this is just one. And after many, many statements from all kinds of world leaders and others who call out the foundations, you are embarked on a major reform. You've got a new chairman in Alex Soros, 37-year-old son of George. You've got layoffs planned of something like 40% or more than 40% of staff as you embark on this major reform. So what is happening at OSF? How should we understand it?
Well, I think that, and by the way, as my colleagues often wryly observe, you can tell the quality of an institution by its choice of enemies. And Elon Musk joins a distinguished rogues gallery of Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, and Mr. Putin. So, in that sense, we're pretty proud of our enemies. But I think, and it probably is worth observing that the first time he attacked George Soros personally, it was just after we'd announced that we'd sold Tesla stock. So, I think take with a slight pinch of salt Elon Musk's suddenly discovery of the virtues of Western civilization. I think his stock price is probably a bigger motivator. But let me and I'm sure I'll be reading about myself on X tomorrow morning after.
Very possibly, yes. Some of this might be there.
Yeah, and if we don't, it means your distribution isn't as good as we all thought, Raj. So look, let me just say that I think that the foundation sector itself faces a little bit of an existential crisis. OSF, because we're in politics and democracy and human rights, maybe at the very front end of that. But foundations in much less controversial areas like health, climate, are facing similar challenges to what's the source of your legitimacy? What right have you to apply very large private fortunes to the solution of public problems that is the better provenance of governments? And so I think there's a huge challenge, and foundations have tended to respond to this challenge by, and this isn't perhaps quite the right phrase because I completely understand why, but the sort of whole trust-based philanthropy to sort of in a way hide behind the grantee who becomes the source of legitimacy because they are in their community helping and working for people they care about. And my vision for OSF is that our legitimacy comes from something else. It is certainly about the trust of our grantees, but it goes beyond that to us being able to say, look, by the use of private money, we are achieving things that public money couldn't achieve because we can take risks, we can be deeply patient about investing in long-term changes, we can be very quick about urgent opportunities and changes. And so judge us by our performance. But if you want to be judged by your performance, then you better perform. And, you said it, for 18 years has been a steady setback in democracy and in human rights. So on the sort of meta metric of outcome, we're not doing very well. And so, we're really trying to sort of refashion ourselves as an organization which says democracy is a huge subject. We're a biggish foundation, biggest in this sector, but still a minnow compared to the size of the problem. So how do we really sort of identify the problems where we can make a difference, partner with grantees around a shared strategic frame of how to make a difference, and be very accountable to each other about that difference? And so we're moving from a foundation which, had a huge portfolio of grantees to a more focused one. And of course, many grantees are rightly anxious, and, and I understand that. But what I would equally say is we're making sure that a big slug of our spending is retained for those sort of long-term human rights and other partners, both globally, but also in difficult places like Palestine, for example, where there are not other funders, that we will go on supporting, because groups like human rights defenders, if we desert them, then we're betraying our fundamental mission. So we're going to stick with the grantees who need us, but add on to that a much better focus, I hope, on getting results. And the final thing I'd just say is, the tragedy about when you make changes in an organization like this is everybody who joins us has joined us because they're passionate about these subjects. They are driven by a strong sense of vocation. So when you have to say to some of them, we really can do it now with a smaller staff, and we can do it sharper and quicker and nimbler with a smaller staff, it's not just like giving somebody a pink slip from a regular job. It is a very deep emotional moment for both sides. And we'll take every effort to make sure those who do leave us go on to very successful careers elsewhere in this same sector.
So a lot of what you're doing, it sounds like, is focusing your efforts and being able to take bigger bets. I guess I'm wondering, are you just changing the size of your grants, or are you changing the way you play the game? Because it seems like your opponents, as big as you are, your annual budget is what, $1.5 billion a year or so? Maybe your opponents are bigger when you think of platforms like X.
Yeah, no, we're up against a formidable, and we're up against states which have assets, armies, security, a ton of stuff we don't have. But I suppose, I come out of a career originally in politics, and the one thing I told my candidates always was, if you've got the best idea, if truth is on your side, even if the other guys have got a lot more money, we'll probably prevail. And so I'm pretty
confident. And you still think that's true?
Yeah, no, I'm pretty confident it'll come our way. Don't think it'll come our way overnight, though. This is going to be a long fight. And so, to the point, no, it's not just about bigger grants. I mean, if I just take democracy, for example, we've experimenting with something we call the Democracy Lab, to give you that sense. And it's all about, new approaches, new champions, new ways of rescuing something which had sort of, in a sense, been almost captured by a sort of Washington establishment in the election sector, and where we think we've got to get fresh champions, fresh approaches. So, we're very much going to try and be innovators in this space, and nor is it all going into big grants. A absolutely critical piece of OSF was always our global dispersed presence, our ability to give small grants to actually nurture organizations and individuals via fellowships from the very beginning. And, that is absolutely key to our DNA, and we're not going to desert or leave that.
It does seem like the U.S. will become a more important focus. Is that right? U.S. politics.
Well, look, yeah, and we're very frank. We've made a bet that, we think American democracy is on the ballot next year. And, if American democracy loses, the global implications are hugely consequential. So, this again, for a foundation which doesn't, is impatient with the sort of normal institutional balances that you spend X in this country and Y and that much and that, because you did that much last year, so you do it plus 5% this year. The core of Soros's father and sons sort of, if you like, philanthropic entrepreneurialism is to say the crisis today is in the US. we've got to tackle it head on. So we're spending $300 million in the US. 5 years ago, we were spending 100 million. And so we'll go on, you know, where we see a threat and challenge to democracy, we don't mind surging in, because, you know, that's the sort of political opportunism that we talk about. It's not a partisan opportunism, but it is about just being absolutely ruthless with ourselves about identifying the immediate threats to democracy as well as the longer term ones, and going after them with a forensic discipline.
It is going to be a very hard challenge to change that curve, that 18-year trend line. Is that how we should measure the success of this reform?
Well, it's a very good question, because it's a, you know, a meta trend line. And of course, you know, ultimately, if it moves, it'll not be just because of us. It will be because of, you know, a whole ecosystem of partners and progressive political people and just Democrats, left and right, around the world. So, you know, I think for us, it's always about seeding things. Ultimately, it's the longer term capital rather than the more urgent capital, which will make the difference. I mean, I'd be fooling myself. I thought we were going to change the outcome of the American election, and it would be appalling if a foundation could. It's going to need every American to step up to do that. But, you know, I do think looking forward, we're moving from this sort of market-based era of globalization to one where states are going to be, again, much more active around trade, climate, geopolitics, security, the rest. And so for us, you know, helping seed the organizations and the thinking and the partners who between them will create the philosophy of that new balance between state and market and civil society is where the ultimate sweet spot is. You know, who will be the next Roosevelts or Trumans, or to take the next time the changes came, the next Reagans or Thatchers, but who are going to build this sort of progressive vision of a kind of inclusive democracy at home and abroad. And it's not going to get designed in London or Washington by the think tanks that design the New Deal or Reaganite economics. It's going to be designed by think tanks in the global South and in other places. So, you know, for us to sort of seek out those people, give them the means to think about the future look of democracy in this new world, is, I think, the really important sort of mission of OSF going forward.
Well, we wanted to end this day and this 2 days of meetings and conversations with you and with this topic, in part because it is underlying everything else we've talked about, whether we can achieve results on climate and health and so many of the other issues reflected in the SDGs comes down to whether people have the voice that they need to address them. So it has been a real pleasure, as always. Mark Malloch-Brown, thank you for sharing the stage. Thank you.